All right, so I think we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. I'd like to introduce myself and welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on Improv for Democracy, how to bridge difference and develop the skills our world most needs. This webinar is in a series of webinars addressing topics aligned with the School of Professional Studies Masters of Science program in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. My name is Andrew Hummer. I'm an advisor at the School of Professional Studies, and I will be facilitating some of our conversations today. If you're able to hear me, please type yes into the Q&A box that you'll see below. We want to make sure that we can hear all our presenters loud and clear today before we dive in. While everyone is typing yes to confirm audio, I do have a few housekeeping announcements to share with the group before we get started. I encourage you to utilize the Q&A function as you develop questions during the presentation. At the end of today's session, we will be addressing some of those questions you share with us. We will not be using the chat box function for this webinar, so please let us know if you have any questions via the Q&A box. I would also like to share with the group that today's session is being recorded and will be made available to you for your convenience. At this time, I would like to welcome today's presenter. Joining us today is Dr. Beth Fisher Yoshida, Academic Director for the MS in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution. Hello, Beth. How are you doing today?
Hi, fine. Thanks, Andy. So we're also going to introduce Don Wysenin, who's the main presenter today. Don, are you there?
I am.
Okay, great. So I'm going to get started setting the context, and then Don will take over from there, and he'll give you a lot more background about who he is and all the great things that he's doing. Okay, so Don, can you just go to the next slide?
Sure.
Good. So what I want to do is set the context for improv in conflict resolution. And some of you may have experience in the field, may have different degrees of experience. Some of you might be new to the field. Some of you may not be in the field, but I'm sure that at one point or other, everybody's had some kind of conflict situation. So let's just say that you are in a situation, maybe you're involved in conflict or you're in there as an intervener or conflict resolver. So one thing is being in the moment and being very present and being able to take in information without going on overload from emotional reaction to some of what's happening there. And so being in the moment, being present, being attuned to what's happening for you in that situation. And improv can be very helpful for that as you gain more awareness of your mind, body, emotional, spiritual state in the moment. Acting with agility means that when you are in a situation, especially one that may catch you off guard, catch you by surprise, that you're able to pivot and change direction. So let's say, for example, you're in a negotiation situation or a mediation and you expect it to take a certain trajectory, but then it doesn't, it goes off on some other tangent. How do you quickly pivot into that situation and then improv what has to be done? Of course, I always recommend people do a lot of preparation before getting involved in a negotiation, and that preparation also involves scenario planning so that you have some anticipation of the different directions it could take, but sometimes it's just unpredictable. Responding with questions. So somebody may say something, somebody may expect a response from you, they may expect you to know the answer in air quotes. And one way of doing that also, especially if you get caught off guard, is to open with questions. So instead of just trying to respond and lose control of your situation in that interchange, you're actually taking control back by seeking more information. And you do that by asking open questions, which gets the other person to be able to explain and expand. And this way it gives you more information, and it also buys you more time to regain control of your emotions if that's what's needed in that moment. And listening for new insights. So many times we get so involved in what we're going to say in our responses, we lose sight of what the other party is actually saying and what the other party is not necessarily saying verbally. There's a lot of information and communication that happens in the unspoken spaces. So listening for new insights, because we may think we have all the information, we may think we know the answers. However, there's always the opportunity for something new to happen. Even if you've heard it many times before, you're different today than you were yesterday, and so you may have a different perspective on that particular situation. and building meaningful relationships. The whole idea about being in communication and being responsive to one another is about building relationships, and conflict resolution happens in that relational space. And so the more you develop your relationship and the deeper understanding you have with each other, the more likely it is that you'll be able to come to a mutual understanding by recognizing each other's humanity and being able to move on with that. So I'm going to step off now and turn it over to Don, and Don's going to do a lot more in improv, and then we'll come back at the end to answer your questions and your comments. Thank you, Don.
Great, thanks, Beth. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I really appreciate you coming. I'm excited to share with you some of these developments in this space, particularly for conflict resolution. So let's get going. About 20 years ago, I went to see a live professional improv comedy show for about the first time. And if any of you have ever been to one of these shows, if you haven't, you got to go see an improv comedy show at some point. What struck me, though, I was really amazed. As funny as this kind of thing is, if you've seen Whose Line Is It Anyway, shows like that, you've seen how funny it is. But I was also really struck just by how well the performers worked with and trusted each other. There was this kind of level of play and joy that you seldom see in everyday life. And the actors would sort of build upon each other's lines and actions, and they practiced seemingly superhuman communication skills. So after this, I was like, I have to take an improv class, and I did, and I have never looked back since that day. For about the past 20 years now, improv for a long time for me was a fun hobby. And also, separately, I was a communication major in college, and I just kept doing improv all the way. I went into graduate school, did communication there as well. And I felt like improv was a way of filling in kind of glaring performance gaps in my formal education. Sometimes in my college communication major, I felt like we were learning how to run a marathon, but never actually doing it. And improv was a space for that. So from there, what ended up happening, I found myself from Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, there's a famous institution called the Groundlings. A lot of actors on Saturday Night Live and a lot of comedy have come out of this institution. There's others like Second City in Chicago and Upright Citizens Brigade, which is both in LA and New York. And I trained at the Groundlings and did sketch comedy and improv, and it was just really fun. It was my side life. Some people play golf. I wanted to go do improv, get up on a stage and have fun. Over the years, this actually developed into a sort of side professional life. I now perform with the National Comedy Theater in New York. Been doing that for about 6-7 years, as well as another group that's nationwide called Comedy Sports. Comedy Sports is in about 25 different cities. It's competitive improv comedy. And again, this was just kind of my side life. It was my fun golf game type thing, and I loved it. And I felt like it really helped with communication training, communication skills while I was particularly going through graduate education. Putting that aside for the moment, though, my real work for a long time has been in civic engagement. I'm currently full-time faculty. I've been past 9 years at a public policy school here in New York City, the Mark School of Public and International Affairs. And a lot of my work is about how we can improve the public discourse and create democratic spaces for citizens' voices. One of the foundations I work with in some of my research and some of my practitioner work is the Kettering Foundation. They have this central question, which really drives a lot of work that I do, is what does it take to make democracy work as it should? A lot of work I do is just driven by that, and trying to find more and better tools for building trustful relationships between people. I'm sure many of you out there, you know about the political polarization that's going on in this country, the kind of hyper-partisanship. Many people have described this, we've got kind of a democracy constantly at risk. And even if you're operating in another country, you know that it's tough to try to build democratic spaces, spaces where good negotiation, effective conflict resolution can happen. That's really been central to my work. At the same time, in the past decade or so, there's been some interesting work emerging around civic education. For instance, the US Department of Education published a report saying that narrow conceptions of civic education are not going to be enough to address the kinds of problems we're seeing in our society, such as polarization, and that we're going to have to find new ways, new methods, new tools, just new paradigms, new ways of thinking for teaching citizens to engage civic skills well. Things like relying on volunteerism and having civics classes are just not going to be enough. We need to really reinvent civic education for the 21st century and think about ways to get people to engage in more social solidarity and civic friendship. As you can imagine, the forces that we face in this realm are mighty. There's a lot of work about online communication in particular, sometimes diminishing citizens' capacities in these areas. And I like the way Art Jensen, who's a colleague at another institution, says we've really got to find our way in the 21st century toward forms of communication that taking those as seriously as we do health and happiness, and expanding people's horizons. And that's really been a lot of my work. So let's bracket that too, just for the moment, and go back to the world of improv. While I've been engaged in improv as a side life and really focused on civic engagement, the business world in the past 20 years really, but more now than ever, has taken up improv as a way for training in essential business skills. Particularly skills that businesses need, like abilities to listen well, be flexible and mindful. Markets can shift from under your feet. And so this is a way of thinking about risk and innovation and building positive professional cultures, has really been taken outside of theatrical context, outside of context of comedy and into the business world. And this is inspired by improv as for comedy entertainment, but it's different. It's for sort of, what are the professional applications of this way of doing things? Folks in the business world really realized this would connect with their work. And so there's been a lot of emerging scholarly research on this too. This is not a matter of speculation at this point. There's one study, for instance, showing that improvisation training really has helped people improve their confidence, their effectiveness, their ability to adapt well. And in the world of negotiation and conflict resolution, that is paramount, as Beth was underscoring. And just being able to be more spontaneous and successfully handle unique situations where things don't go your way. So while this was developing, I decided to develop a course for executive MBA students called Improv for Leadership. Been teaching this for a number of years now. It's become an incredibly popular course in our executive MBA curriculum here at CUNY, and it's great. Students are sitting around. They usually have classes in accounting. They're just sitting there passively for a year, and then along comes my class, and every class we're up on our feet, we're doing stuff, we're doing listening exercises and having fun at the same time. And so it's really taken off in this kind of corporate MBA type space in a big way. Another development, however, is that Alda, who was an actor, star on MASH, not only wrote a book, but has been leading the Center for Science Communication up at SUNY Albany, training scientists to communicate their research and what they're working on to the public much better. And they've had an absolute heyday with this, to the point where the National Science Foundation just gave them a $1 million grant. And a lot of it is improv based. They get scientists to come up, grad students, PhD students to come up and deliver presentations and go through improv training and just get much more comfortable on their feet and in the moment. It's this whole side of education that you just can't get through reading books. Like, you've got to do it. And you've got to, I used to have a mentor that would say, we need an education that takes place for the nervous system. It's a learning that occurs by the nervous system, a learning below the neck. And that's what this kind of education really engages. At the same time, this other really interesting front has taken place, particularly at Northwestern University, called Medical Improv, which is the uses of improvisation training to help physicians and doctors do their work better. If you've ever had a doctor who had a poor bedside manner, you know the effects that has. And the medical industry in particular has picked up on this as a means of really helping people adapt well to unique situations. So I could go on and on, but there's actually a network called the Applied Improvisation Network. This is like, where's Waldo? I swear I'm in there somewhere. It's all folks who do this. We take the applications of improv outside of theatrical contexts, and we're sort of spreading it around the world, doing workshops and applying this in areas you would never think something that started in improv comedy would apply to. So back to my work for a moment. Some interesting things have happened in the world of scholarship around this stuff. One on the right I want to highlight really quick. Josh Lerner, who leads the Participatory Budgeting Project in New York City, wrote a book, MIT Press, a few years back, called Making Democracy Fun, where he talks about the ability of citizens to get together and be engaged and really figure out how it is we're all going to live together, that's really the point of politics, is usually pretty unappealing. The processes we have for democracy and democratic initiatives are often, as Lerner puts it, boring, painful, and pointless. And he contrasts this with an area of life that people volunteer countless hours to, which is games, whether it's video games or board games or any kind of games you can think of, sports even. So there's been this movement to think more seriously about how do we make things like politics and democracy more appealing and more engaging, the building of civic skills in particular. Let's sort of use that as a base for thinking through how we might train people in these skills. So immediately sparks started flying, and the book on the left is an old one by Augusto Boal on legislative theater, which was about the same kinds of things that Lerner is taking up in his project. And I started thinking, wow, we've done improv for business. What would it be to do improv for democracy at this point? So I'm currently finishing up a book on this very subject, and I want to show you, I have 5 bright spots. I think these are, it's best to see this in action, see key examples of what this can look like. And I'm using these bright spots in the book I'm writing to really think through ways of using this for conflict training, negotiation training, you name it, anything in the public interest that can help citizens bridge differences in particular. Did want to highlight just really quickly off the last example, former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor had a piece recently where she was interviewed, and she talked about when she took civics classes in school, in high school, she found them tremendously boring and not that useful to her career. Really interesting. It's not that we shouldn't have these classes, but she said, again, along the same lines of what Josh Lerner was doing, we've got to make these things more interesting and engaging. And she actually started a site called iCivics to help students engage in civic education. It's got gamification features to it. So I found that fascinating recently, just to see a former Supreme Court justice of all people going in this direction and seeing this as an important movement to build upon. So my first bright spot I want to highlight is called the Detroit Creativity Project. It was a lot of improvisers, some famous, Michael Keegan Key, who you'll see, who's been Comedy Central, got shows, Key and Peele, and a lot of others came together to build after-school programs in Detroit public school districts. And one of the fascinating things I've learned about this in the time it's been going on is that they're getting in many of these after-school programs that use improv to help students build different skills, and sometimes their literacy skills even. They've got different outcomes aligned with their improv training, is that they've got like total participation from students in the after-school programs, whereas in the rest of the day, they struggle with truancy issues and filling students in seats. So I want you to get a glimpse of this. This is best seen rather than just talked about. So I'm going to show you a video for a moment of exactly what this looks like.
The Detroit Creativity Project, at least in its initial phase, is a program to offer improv instruction in the public schools of Detroit.
Who are all these people? Where did you come from? Why are you here?
I love improv. It's just off the head.
I think that improvisation is one of probably the best skills that a person can learn for life.
There's really no class that you take that teaches you how to listen and how to get your points across. Improvisation does that. This program isn't just for actors who want to create a career for themselves. This program is for regular people who want to create a better self.
Improv skills help in everything. If you're in an interview and you don't know how to respond to a question, those improv skills kick in.
When you come downstage in improvisation, you get a couple of suggestions from the audience, and then you create something out of nothing. You finish that and realize, I just did something impossible. What I just did is impossible. Everything else seems easy.
This is one of the best things that have ever happened in Detroit. Art funds are cut all the time. And it's really sad because we have a lot of people that have just performance in their hearts, and like not a lot of people get to express that.
We're starting with improv because that's where we all come from. But with hope, this program will blossom, and we'll be able to send artists into school to share their gifts in many art forms, whether that be the visual arts in painting or filmmaking, in fashion, in music.
People's view of Detroit is that it's a rundown city and there's only violence and crime. But what people don't see is programs like this who are trying to help people, which will make Detroit a better place.
And I think the one thing that's true about almost any Detroiter you meet is that they've got huge dreams.
My dream is to be in the NBA.
I want to be a famous singer.
Electrical engineer.
Marine biologist.
An actor.
There's so much I want to be. And I think dreams are what.
Great. I hope one of the things you notice from this is just how playful this is. This skill development is taking place in such a playful register. The students, participants in this, are able to get out and actually have fun while they're doing this. And I think that's really a unique contribution that improv has to this type of thing.
The Detroit
sorry.
Project, at least.
I'm going to advance. Let's see. How do we move on? The next one, bright spot number 2, I want to show you, and this relates directly to negotiation and conflict. I found this, I'm doing a case analysis of this in the book, is the United States Embassy, of all places, was hiring improv teachers and trainers to do work on its behalf. And one of the applications here, the example is of Cyprus, where instructors ran, there were extensive improvisational sessions as part of the embassy's ongoing effort to facilitate reunification of the island by fostering dialogue between people with shared interests and goals. And, you know, there's a lot of negotiation on interests, looking to interests. And the interests here were sort of lessons in agreement between Greek and Turkish Cypriots about how to raise the borders and live as one people and find areas of mutual interest and agreement. And so I found that fascinating, that there was this experimentation around this, quite successful from what I can see, in terms of we've got to go beyond the traditional methods of dialogue and conflict training, right? And I'll be the first to admit to all of you, I run a lot of public dialogues and deliberations here in New York City on very contentious political issues oftentimes. And one of the things I think improv has to offer traditional forms of dialogue training is, again, this emphasis on playfulness. Oftentimes dialogue, people come to it with a very somber spirit and a serious spirit, and I think that is incredibly important work. But the improv helps us flip to the other side of what is it like to do this same kind of work, but in a more playful voice, with playful actions. All right, bright spot number 3. This was Philippines disaster relief training. After Typhoon Haiyan in 2014, there were applied improv workshops developed all over the Philippines to get citizens, and particularly disaster relief workers, to feel what it was like and practice their responses to unpredictable situations, right? So there was this felt need, this realization that just going to seminars and there's bullet point filled PowerPoints and learning in that way for these types of experiences was not going to be enough, that we needed a kind of training, a set of philosophy and set of techniques that would help people deal with the unpredictable. And I could go on and on about this example, and there's others in the area of disaster relief, but I found this really extraordinary. This was run through Heroic Improvisation, a workshop in the Philippines. Moving forward, bright spot number 4 is, I think, the Institute for Improvisation and Social Action. This is an organization that's on the US-Mexico border that's working with different communities down there and using improvisation and the arts in particular to try to create new ways to grow and develop and talk about the kinds of border issues that have developed not only on the national level, but that are affecting local communities. This is a fascinating organization, and they're really interested most in helping people gain voice where they don't seem to have voice, and finding ways to do it through embodied actions as well as voice. So they do a lot of sort of public, going into public spaces and doing performances and things. So I could say so much more about this, but that's my 4th bright spot. My last bright spot, number 5 here, is the one that has most hit me in realizing the potential for this kind of work. This example took place in the city of Gouda in the Netherlands. And similar to here in the US, there were a lot of problems between the police and youth in this city. And I could go into the reasons why this was, but just the main thing to know here is there was a lot of problems, a lot of shouting, a lot of distrust on the streets. to the point where local organizations, it had become so bad, local organizations like restaurants were refusing service to the young people, and just, distrust filled the air. It was horrible. So facilitators came in for a year, and as part of the intervention, among a number of things, including sort of traditional dialogue training, they had the young people and the police play improv games with each other. A very non-traditional method. So go ahead and watch this for a moment. I want you to see the effect this had in this region.
Dan kan er ook niks veranderen en gaat er ook niks gebeuren. Ik kom nog terug. Kom je straks terug? Kom je straks terug? Ilias is gestart met heel weinig interesse en weinig vertrouwen in de politie. En op een gegeven moment kwam Ilias naar mij toe en zei: ik wil graag een debat organiseren. Hij heeft daar een onderwerp uitgekozen wat iedereen natuurlijk aangaat. Uitgaan, gouden. Ja, het gaat een beetje moeilijk als je nergens uit kan gaan of nergens binnen kan komen. Die jongens worden overal geweigerd.
De politie werd verweten van, ja, jullie controleren altijd maar en gaan gelijk bekeuringen schrijven. Aan de andere kant werd de politie gezegd, ja, maar jullie hangen altijd maar daar en op het moment dat we controle uitvoeren, dan beginnen jullie te schreeuwen. En die discussies waren gewoon vanuit het respect en vervolgens vanuit het begrip naar elkaar. En ik denk dat dat de grootste winst is.
Er zijn ook sommige agenten die zo praten, maar op straat zijn ze gewoon heel anders. Dan denk ik van, waarom heb ik mijn vertrouwen aan die agent gegeven?
We doen gewoon exact dezelfde scène. Alleen nu zijn de jongeren de politie is de jongeren.
So I have to just stop here for a moment and highlight exactly what's happening. So you see they were engaged in different dialogues, but as part of this, this is one of the improv exercises they did. They had the police and the youth switch roles for a day. So the young people had to dress up as police officers and go around town giving the police officers a hard time. And the police officers had to stand on the side of the street yelling at the young people. Really interesting situation of role playing and building empathy. So watch this for a moment. Oops, sorry, go back. Oops.
We doen gewoon exact dezelfde scène. Alleen nu zijn de jongeren de politie is de jongeren. Jullie vragen hun identiteit en zeggen dat ze hier weg moeten. Ja? Op zijn polities, ja.
We begonnen met spelletjes met elkaar spelen om elkaar beter te leren kennen. Mag ik vragen waarom we hier staan?
Hangen je toch altijd, dat weet je toch?
En het grappige is wel dat de jongeren willen natuurlijk graag politie spelen. En de politie, die wil heel graag de jongeren spelen.
Bedoel je nu om weg te gaan? Laatste keer. Ik bedoel je nu om weg te gaan? Je moet ook met elkaar kunnen lachen. Als je met elkaar gelachen hebt, dan kan je daarna ook kritiek op elkaar uitoefenen.
De jongeren moeten leren om de politieagenten te respecteren en zich te verplaatsen in hun schoenen. En wat de politie moet leren, is ja, dat wij eigenlijk ook in een bepaalde tijd van ons leven zitten. Dat wij ook gezellig met elkaar willen zijn.
Toen ik op straat reed in een politieauto, samen met collega's zat ik in de auto en toen kwam ik een jongere tegen die op straat stond samen met nog een jongen. En het was alleen even zwaaien naar elkaar. Vorig jaar had ik dat waarschijnlijk niet gedaan, had hij ook absoluut niet naar mij gezwaaid, nu zwaaiden we naar elkaar. En ik moet waarschijnlijk uitleggen waarom hij naar mij zwaait. En ik moest in ieder geval uitleggen aan mijn collega waarom ik naar hem zwaaide.
Nog een keer?
Ja.
Ik heb een debat georganiseerd voor jongeren en de politie. Toen had ik bijvoorbeeld vragen van hoe kijkt de jongeren naar de politie en hoe kijkt de politie naar de jongeren. En er werden heel veel verschillende meningen over gegeven. En toen werd het eigenlijk 2 in 1. Toen zagen ze ook elkaar een beetje anders.
Ik heb gisteravond ook de vraag gesteld van, is dit project een verrijking voor de politie? Dennis en nog een aantal collega's, die hebben gewoon duidelijk ja geantwoord. Ik ben verlost van mijn negativiteit. Negatief gevoel wat ik had over die jongen.
Notice in this example, just the laughter that ensued between these two different groups. And I just love this last phrase. This police officer says, I've been released of my negativity, the negative feeling I had toward these boys. So this isn't only in the Netherlands. Michael Schulman, a couple of years back, drew our attention here I'm operating out of New York City. Improv for Cops, similar thing took place at the Irondale Theater. And there's also another organization called the All Stars Project here in New York, which has been doing similar things with police and youth. So this way of approaching very difficult, contentious conflict situations has really been blossoming in just the past 2 to 3 years alone. And it's really hit me about like what's the potential for this to scale and embed this kind of work in more organizations, particularly community organizations, and scale it. So in that spirit, my main idea that I've been working with is that improv can advance civic engagement and democracy. I see this as a kind of recovery project because many folks who started improv comedy, improv theater here in the US, I've been doing archival research on this, have talked about what, this was always meant to be about what's important about being human in a community first, before it was about improv for comedy entertainment and a lot of those other things. So I'm imagining, I'm just trying to think about how different the world could look if improv teaching and training methods were part of every educational system, professional development program, and community writ large. And so, and I compare this, frankly, I'm in academia, I'm an academic first and foremost, and there has been a lot of ink spilled about what democracy should look like. But this project really has gotten me to focus more on how to actually train citizens in democratic skills. I think that question has been bypassed in too much scholarship, especially. And so I'm seeking to sort of, as W. Barnett Pierce talks about, use this as a means of pulling societies upward. And I think especially in public sector work, this is really needed. Doris Graber had a book years ago where she talked about innovation is one of the hardest things to do in public sector work. And dealing with the contingencies of a governing environment and having mutual interaction rather than just kind of barking orders with traditional kind of political methods. And so I think there's a lot more that this kind of philosophy and way of training has to offer our democracy. So I wanted to show you, I've been doing for several years now in City University of New York and in other places. I've done workshops around the world at different universities. I've been running a course called Improv for Democracy. And this is my graduate students in this course. And this is, to use the metaphor from Heifetz, Gresham, and Linsky, we talk about being on the balcony, having a reflective space, but also getting on the dance floor is really important to this kind of work. And here's the student. This is what class looks like most of the time. You can see there's no rows of seats set up with a PowerPoint in front. We are doing this stuff. We're learning to work together, using our minds, bodies, our spirits, hopefully, to do this. And so I just want to add, this is really the point at which I would usually turn if we were meeting in person. I would have you actually do this stuff and experience that. And I think what I'm going to do instead is we'll go to Q&A sooner rather than later. And if you want to talk about what I would do from here, we can go there. But I do want to end with one thing. And this is a great quote from John Cleese I love. He said, when you have a lot of warm, friendly, funny faces coming at you, you respond very naturally. I'm struck by how laughter connects you to people. It's almost impossible to maintain any kind of distance or any sense of social hierarchy when you're just howling with laughter. Laughter is a force for democracy. So thank you, everybody, for listening to this. And let's open up for Q&A. Would love to discuss more of this with you.
John, thank you. That was great. So while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I just had a couple of reflections. I would have loved to have been the procurement officer in Cyprus, having to approve a request for improv training. That must have been so much fun.
Right. Can you imagine?
I know. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I was thinking about is, I mean, I can imagine some things, but from the improv perspective and your work perspective, if everything is so great about improv, just to also look like what gets in the way of people either wanting to do it or believing they can do it or being able to do it. What are some things that are challenges people may find?
There's a lot of mistaken beliefs coming into it, right? So I would say the biggest one, first of all, and many of you are probably thinking this, like you came into this webinar thinking, oh, this is about winging it. And I love Jill Bernard and Patrick Short have a line. They say, this is not about winging it. It's about observing, connecting, and responding at a much more heightened level than usual, to paraphrase them. It's really about those things. It's about our ability to react well. It's about our, you know, again, so people think, oh, I'm not good on my feet and I'm not funny. First of all, this isn't about being funny at all. What ends up happening when you do this type of training, there's a lot of laughter, there's a lot of funniness that comes out of it, but that's really not the goal. The goal is to get more comfortable on your feet and more like you mentioned at the beginning, Beth, the you know, responding to questions.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, this is about being more responsive with people and getting out of your head and getting more connected with others. That's really at the root of this.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I remember in other situations when you put us through the activity of yes and instead of saying but, and I'm thinking about in conflict situations and when people have that something in that space between them that gets in the way of them being able to communicate effectively, a lot of times we shut down conversations rather than opening them up.
That's
and
right.
It looks to me like improv has ways of opening up instead of just shutting down the conversation. So, for example, you're in a negotiation, you're in a situation, and you ask something, and the other person says no. And it's almost like that hand in your face, no. Well, that totally could shut down a conversation. So what are some, I'm just asking off the top of your head, what are some techniques or strategies people might practice in improv that might help them in those kinds of situations?
Yeah, the yes and principle, just for any of you who've never heard of it or those of you have, it gets I think incorrectly understood. Sometimes people think it's about agreeing with other people. That's not the basis for it. What it is to recognize, one of the ways I start my classes on this, I talk about we all have our default settings. There's ways we are all physiologically strung, right? For some of us, it's that saying no is just automatic. Like that's our way of life. And sometimes we'll say yes, but what the yes and principle gets out is it's not that no isn't important. No is incredibly important. Debate is incredibly important. Critique is incredibly important. But when that's the only tool you have at your disposal, you will not be effective at navigating the world of people who, you know, so this gets us to bring out, do you have also do you have critical skills, the ability to say no, but do you also have this important skill set of being able to affirm what somebody just did, not deny it, and build upon it? And that's what yes and does. So it's saying you could be incredibly against what somebody just said, but the yes and has you go, I affirm what you did, you show them that you're with them, that you heard them, and you try to build on that first before getting to areas of disagreement. And there is a slew of social science about this. There's a theory called social judgment theory. It's all about this. Starting from that place of affirmation is important before you go to areas of disagreement, because we know you just start with disagreement and saying no, there can be psychological reactants, and it's very hard to make have any kind of resolution or manage a conflict well after that.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that, because I think a lot of times we misconstrue what that means when you say yes and so
Right.
Sometimes people think, yes, not only am I agreeing, but I'm losing. So if I'm in a conflict situation, if I'm challenging you, you're challenging me, I'm feeling challenged, then I don't want to say yes, because I don't want there to be any misunderstanding that you might think I'm agreeing with you, when in actuality, you're not.
That's right. Yeah. And it's the and is the really important part. It's the yes is affirmation. It's not agreement. It's just saying, like, I recognize your feelings, where you're coming from. I think, you know, it's just trying to build a bridge initially and then try to build upon it first. But it's not agreement necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's especially challenging, I would imagine, with people who are in conflict, that you don't even necessarily want to acknowledge the existence of the other person, and certainly not necessarily acknowledge another person's feelings or what they say. So being able to get past that can be challenging.
That's right.
In situations.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. So I'm just going to look here at the some of the questions and comments that have come in. And somebody was asking the source of the John Cleese quote, because it is lovely.
Oh, I do have that. It's in my book. Could you just write down your email address and I will send it to you? I do have that. I just need to click on the end note. I have that. I will send it to you directly.
Or we can wait until your book comes out and then the person has to look it up. I'm just kidding.
I'll save you the time.
Yeah. Okay, good. And another person asks, serious, in the public sector, everyone is crazy about measurement of interventions. Right. Are there any interesting measures that have been used for these things?
As in, have there been any studies to measure if this has been effective? Is that what the question's asking?
That's what I'm thinking the question means.
Yeah, and also measurement is a mindset that this plays with a little bit. That Rosamund Zander and Ben Zander have a book. I think it's Harvard University Press. It's all about this, the world of measurement and calculation versus the world of possibility. And they talk about, we could go a lot into this, but I've got hundreds of studies at this point on, I mean, we're talking sort of peer-reviewed research stuff at this point, on how this has improved people's ability to work with each other, listen better, feel lighter on their feet, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's interesting because not only is there sort of there's evidence for this now, but it also challenges the measurement paradigm at a time when I think it needs challenge. There's somebody who wrote a book, it's Against Metrics, Against the Tyranny of Metrics or something like that. Recently, it's Princeton University Press, and Improv kind of goes along with that line of thinking a bit. I'm into measurement and methods that go along with that, but I think there's also a critique that can be made of measurement through this kind of philosophy too.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes people who are dependent on funding for their projects, then sometimes even if their own thinking is more advanced than that, they still have to do things such as measurement, right, for satisfying the funders and the requests because they haven't necessarily caught up to
That's
the
right.
current thinking.
Well, let me go to Alan Alda's example, right? So why did Alan Alda and the folks up there, the professors up there, the practitioners get, they're getting NSF grants now. What they basically did was they did before and after videos to start with. They would take somebody trying to explain a scientific project or a climate scientist getting up, trying to explain about climate change. And they would show before, like doing a presentation before on that. And then they would take them through 6 weeks of improv training. And then they would show this person communicating the same information after. And it is stunning to see. You can go onto YouTube and see these videos. That's where they started. And then they started doing more measurement and evaluation around it. It's like, yep, this is a real thing. People are really improving from this. So the Alan Alda Center for Science Communication is a great place to start for measurement on this.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So there's evidence, but it's not traditional measurement, right? The before and after video is evidence that it works.
Sorry, say that again?
I'm saying that the before and after videos are evidence that it works, but it's not necessarily traditional measurement, but it is a form of evidence.
But there are also traditional forms of measurement, a lot of studies on this from different fields on the effectiveness of this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see what else we have here. All right, so one person said, well, no is your hammer, is everybody a nail? And then he also says that, so yes and is a Twitter favorite. Good. And then somebody did put his email in for you to send that, and bar graphs are king. Okay, I guess that's a statement, not really a question. There's another question here. How does culture fit in improv during negotiations? And there's a second question, but let's do that one first. How does culture fit in improv during negotiations? You have culture, you have negotiations, you have improv.
Yeah, a couple things on this. So Beth, you'll be familiar with my first thing on this. When I ran this in London last year, Beth was there. We had a participant from Japan who said, in Japan, we need more of the no, not more of the yes and. And that led to an interesting discussion. And he said, there's sort of a norm of agreement and those types of things. And one of the contributions I think that came out of that discussion was that actually the word and was important there, that in a lot of Japanese culture, agreement and just nodding and right, those are critical, but building on others' ideas is a little bit of a newer idea to that. So it's both words, it's not just one or the other. And I think there was a previous comment about yes being like a Twitter retweet, and I would say no actually, because a Twitter retweet doesn't necessarily, that's just agreement. It's not building upon the conversation. It's not adding something new in addition to the affirmation of the original comment. And that's really what improv gets you to do. I was
going to build on that comment about the woman from Japan. And the other thing is, so having lived in Japan, so one of the things about in Japanese culture is you don't want to be perceived as or act confrontationally. So you won't say no. You won't just contradict. So you say yes, even if you're in total disagreement. So introducing that whole concept of yes and building on is still being in harmony, right, which is a very important value there, but not necessarily being contradictory and not necessarily only accommodating and succumbing to what that person wants. Is you are still building relationship and keeping the harmony. So it was that was a nice part of what happened last year. Yeah.
That's great. And I would also add, so there's an exercise we do where I get people, it's one of the first ones we do if we were in a room together here, where we say that get two people together and you say the numbers 1, 2, and 3 at the same time, and then you say any word. So like 1, 2, 3, and one person might say orange and the other person says building, and you keep doing that until you come to the same word. And in the reflections on this exercise, people start high-fiving as soon as they get to the same word. In the reflections on this exercise, I take folks to, it's a concept from intercultural and global communication research called shared empathy, or the building of a third culture, which is that in a lot of traditional intercultural training, we treat culture as, oh, I have a culture and you have a culture and we're in different places and we all have fixed cultures that we're just trying to negotiate across. What improv brings to this and this idea of shared empathy or building a third culture is that actually the more trust building you do with somebody and the more communication you have over time, you end up building a third culture, a culture that's unique to yourselves. So my analogy here would be if you have a best friend, you've been best friends forever, sometimes best friends kind of end up developing their own language, if that makes sense. So there's like words we come up with that only that other person knows or references. And we end up, it's not just that we're from different cultures, it's that there is an ability to build a third culture between people that didn't even exist before we started communicating with each other. So in improv training, we highlight that a lot, which is not only in the literature on culture and negotiation, but I think is a way of bringing out through improv instruction.
Great. The second part of this person's question was, how do we reconcile reflection/balcony, preparation, active listening with improv during a negotiation?
So Michael Wheeler at the Harvard Negotiation Project came out with a book a couple of years ago. It's all about this. It's about in negotiation, all those things are great. And I'll be the first to say I teach BATNA, I teach planning, negotiation is a lot about preparation, significantly about preparation. But I think this area is actually under-theorized in the area of negotiation. Once we get into the negotiation, something goes awry. What are we going to do? So I agree with you, what you said earlier, Beth. I think building little contingency plans, what about A, B, C is good. But also just getting better at working on one's feet and working in and managing the unexpected. That's what improv training brings to negotiation now. And Wheeler's book was all about this and the need to really build out this area in the future.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great book, by the way, too, Michael Wheeler's book. Let's see, what are good resources to pull from to introduce improv for negotiation, conflict resolution to undergraduate, whoops, my thing's moving. Peace studies students outside of the classroom? So good improv resources.
Good improv resources. So there's quite a few at this point. So a new book came out this year called Applied Improvisation by Teresa Dudek and Caitlin McClure. It's Methuen Press. Yeah, it's just called Applied Improvisation. First thing if you put it into Amazon, they have an entire section of the book on negotiation and conflict resolution. Barbara Tint, who's the president of the Applied Improvisation Network, teaches negotiation conflict resolution, and she has been building out a kind of curriculum in this area. That's really the best book to start with.
Great, thank you. Okay, how about 1 to 3 easy to explain and run improv exercises that work for giving parties and disagreement practice at working together, like air shapes from the Alda book? Maybe just one. We don't have too much time.
I mean, I think the one that I mentioned earlier where they do the numbers 1, 2, and 3 together. I had a class that I was teaching at NYU where I started with that one, and I had folks talk about they wish they had done that. They were going to start doing that before they ran a dialogue session or a staff meeting. So it's, again, you say the words, 1, 2, and 3. Two people say the words 1, 2, and 3 at the same time, and then the fourth thing they say is a word, and they can't pre-plan it, but the goal is to eventually come to the same word. And it's a great one for, when you start a meeting and, the expectation is it's going to be a staff meeting or negotiation, you can cut through the air. It's so weighty with the kind of negativity sometimes that, just getting people up on their feet to do something like that can build sort of positivity into the environment. But I do hope to be out with the book soon, and I got a lot more along those lines.
Great. I'm wondering how there might be a difference between applying improv skills to mediate a conflict between two parties, with you being the impartial go-between, and negotiating with one of the parties. So I guess it's the role of improv in the difference between negotiation or mediation.
No, Beth, do you have a perspective on that?
Well, I'm thinking, as a mediator, you also have to think on your feet, not only as a negotiator. So I would say that if parties seem to be stuck or that they're not really hearing each other, introducing something from improv, I think, could work very well as a mediator as well. So I see the applicability in both situations. Your role in it is different, but there's still a way of introducing improv. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in the literature about sometimes the need to just step outside of the existing space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I see that as a potential feature. Hey, let's go to lunch, come back. We're going to start with this little exercise,
Right.
Just to break the spiral folks are in sometimes.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now you get a free plug because you're being asked for it. What is the name of your upcoming book? Who is publishing it, and when does it get released?
The name is this seminar. It's Improv for Democracy, and it's probably going to be subtitle How to Bridge Differences and Develop the Communication, Leadership, and Civic Skills Our World Needs. And I'm actively courting publishers right now. I'm just about done with it. So I'm hoping to have it released by June of next year. That's my target.
Super. Has anyone done online improv in a peace building context?
It's funny, before I did this webinar, I was consulting folks in the Applied Improv Network about this, and I couldn't find examples, but I would love for you or others to invent it. I think this is an area we have to address if we're going to go further with this kind of way of thinking and training.
Well, it is interesting. I'll just think out loud like I normally do. And just to say that the NECR program is launching an online or hybrid platform in January. It's a one-year intensive online with 3 weeks face-to-face on campus in the summer. So maybe we can think creatively about doing something as an online program, and it could be conflict resolution, peace building, or something like that. So
right.
We can just put that on the back burner, but let it cook a little bit and see where we are with that.
And I'll just share, I was trying to think of ways to do what we would do in this webinar. And I think we could have come up with something, but the key thing, folks who have done things like this it's usually when we're all seeing each other on a screen that there's exercise activities we can do. It's when there's no face or it's just our voices. I think it gets a little bit more difficult, but doesn't mean it can't be invented.
Yeah, and a lot of these online platforms also provide for ways of having interactive discussion groups also, so that maybe there could be ways of doing it, especially if there were some activities, seeing where it goes from there.
Right.
Like you could do the 1, 2, 3 word exercise you were talking about.
Right.
And then take it somewhere else from there.
Do it in the chat feature, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then somebody said, many thanks, interesting new concept. So we're almost towards the end of our time. If anybody has a last comment or so. Somebody said, thank you for your ideas and insights. Anything else you'd like to add, Don, that maybe one of these questions or comments sparked that you maybe didn't cover or that you want to reiterate?
I think just overall, this is something to be very much in the spirit of improv. It's not under the purview of any one person. Like this is something that we can all invent together. And just, for some of you, it may not be using improv specifically, but kind of the spirit that's generated here of finding more playful means of helping people bridge differences. I think for me, that's really the biggest thing of all. Cultivating connections with unlikely partners and finding ways just to bridge differences that don't look like the typical ways of doing things. That's really an area that, those who are in this program coming into it, I hope you go further with and sort of, use your existing understandings of conflict and negotiation, but also invent new means and new methods for doing this, because I think that's really what the world needs most.
That's great. And the other thing I like about it, as I was just thinking about it as you're talking, is it's so relational. It's so based in relationship and not just what's in your own head.
Right.
Okay, 2 more comments. One is, when do you next perform, Don? Another plug.
It's all over the place. I have 3 kids, so that's its own performance.
I was going to say, right.
But yeah, I would say Comedy Sports in New York City is one. I kind of bounce around all over the place. It's the nature of improv. We just show up when we can to do it, and that's what I love about it. Frankly, it's just like I don't have a lot of time, so I can just go. We're gonna do it, and then it's over. And whatever the thing is we did, it'll never be done again.
There you go. So no set date at this time.
Not right now. Nope.
Alrighty, good. Another comment is somebody wrote, thank you for reminding me how below the neck or nervous system learning is a beautiful alternative to using the brain. I'm helping CEOs and would love to speak further with you. And somebody left their email. And then there's somebody else who said, can we get on the mailing list for your engagements?
Sure. If you want to send me any of the folks who participated in this, I will gladly send out as much as I can.
Okay, so maybe when Andy closes the session in a few minutes, then he can mention something about how people can let him know that they want to be included in that.
Great.
Alrighty, so we are going to pull this to a close. Just one last chance for a final question or comment coming in. And then I do want to thank people for participating. And if there's any other information you'd like to know about the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program, we're all here to answer your questions and elaborate on things. We do have information on the website, and we're constantly trying to update it and give more information on what faculty are doing. Because one of the things I have to say about the program is that there are really fabulous colleagues I have here who do some really interesting work, and we'd like to get Don involved with this too. Thank you, Don.
Great, you bet. Thank you so much.
Okay, Andy, want to take it over?
Yeah. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so I will be able to hand that out to all of the attendees and everybody that has registered either later on today or tomorrow. I will be sure to let everybody know in that email about Don's email address, if that's okay with you, Don, or?
Please do, that's fine, yep.
Okay, all right, and I just want to thank you, you and both Beth as well, and if you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me at my email address, and I'll be able to talk to you guys about the program or about the presentation. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much.